Well, welcome to the campus of Faulkner University. It's a distinct honor that we have to be a host tonight for this distinguished forum, and just appreciate the opportunity to be engaged in this really good night. This is our 75th anniversary here at Faulkner, and we have celebrated for 75 years trying to attempt to prepare our students to be engaged citizens, to take what they learn here in the classroom and apply it to address the real-world challenges. And so tonight is an effort for us to help the community, for the community of the River region to be more engaged and more enlightened as far as our candidates who are envisioning a more flourishing Montgomery, a more flourishing state of Alabama, and a great nation. So it's an honor to have you here on our campus today. Thank you so much to the Federalist Society. They've been a great partner of ours in a number of different engagements, especially with the Blackstone Burke Center for Law and Liberty. And so thank you so much for your sponsorship of this great event. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Alan Mendenhall, who's our Executive Director of the Blackstone Burke Center for Law and Liberty, who is going to orchestrate this event and serve as our narrator tonight. Dr. Mendenhall.
Well, good evening and welcome to Faulkner University. I am Alan Mendenhall. I'm an Associate Dean in the Law School and Executive Director of the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty. We've had people travel as far as from Washington, D.C. to be here tonight, so thank you to everybody who has come out. And special thanks to the candidates for taking time out of their busy campaign schedule to be here. By participating in this forum, they provide an indispensable service to the citizens whose votes they seek. Two candidates, Republican Troy King and Democrat Joseph Siegelman, were invited to participate but declined the invitation. Since the earliest days of our republic, political candidates have gathered together at fora such as this to debate ideas and submit working principles to the combined judgment and wisdom of the people. We're thus here tonight as part of a long-standing tradition that characterizes who we are as people of Alabama and of the United States of America. The rules that govern tonight's forum are as follows. Each candidate will be given 5 minutes for opening statements. At the conclusion of opening statements, I will begin submitting questions to the candidates. The candidates will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. For both the opening statements and the subsequent questioning, I have pre-selected the order in which the candidates will field questions. Therefore, the order in which the candidates supply answers to questions will vary. If any candidate poses a question regarding a question, I will respond by repeating the question. I will not attempt to clarify or revise any questions. At the conclusion of the question and answer portion of each of the forum, each candidate will be allowed 3 minutes for closing statements, rebuttals, respond to any claims by other candidates made during the question and answer period. If any candidate finishes early, the candidate is welcome to just take the seat. Timer is straight ahead of you at the table. I want to thank the Federalist Society. Without its support, this event would not be possible. I've had the honor of serving as president of the Montgomery Lawyers Chapter of the Federalist Society for the last 5 years. The Federalist Society is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. Having dispensed with these preliminaries, I'll now turn to opening statements, which will proceed in the following order by candidate: Steve Marshall, Alice Martin, Ches Bedsole, Chris Christie. Timer, are we ready? Okay, everyone please keep your seats during the questions. General Marshall, please begin.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I appreciate not only Faulkner serving as a host on what I hope is a very substantive debate tonight, but also the Federalist Society believing that it's appropriate to bring all the candidates that were willing to be able to come here tonight to be able to share what I think should be the focus of this discussion, which is what is our vision and belief about the role of Attorney General for Alabama. Because unlike maybe the candidates here, I'm the one that has had to confront that right now in the role that I have. In February of 2017, I had the privilege of becoming the 48th Attorney General of Alabama. I walked into this job, candidly, for the last roughly 20 years of my life, being very focused on public safety issues, wondering how it is that I could work to keep my community safer when I was a district attorney in Marshall County and also prosecuting municipally in some of our local cities. Very much for me has been this idea of what is the role and function that I could have as that advocate in the court, but also what could I do to be able to change the law in ways that allowed us to be able to keep our community safer. Fully prepared when I became Attorney General to have those public safety discussions about what it means to prosecute cases of violent crime, to deal with issues of overdose and addiction and how that's impacting our criminal justice system, to be able to talk about enforcing our ethics laws and convicting individuals in front of a jury. So I felt very comfortable when I began this job, and that was something that I knew about and something that I was very passionate about. But y'all, what has been the most exciting thing about serving in this role now is understanding how I could have an influence outside the state of Alabama. And most importantly, how it is that I have the opportunity to be able to enforce the rule of law. Again, it's not something I have to tell you about what I would do as Attorney General. In fact, it's what I can tell you about what I've done. You've seen it this week, just simply 2 days ago. We joined with 6 other states to be able to say that the DACA program is unconstitutional. Not stepping up as a matter of trying to interject myself into immigration policy in this country, but instead to be able to say that the rule of law matters. That when we know that Justice Scalia talked about that 4th branch of government being somewhat our regulatory agencies, when they overstep their bounds, one of the clear roles and purposes for conservative Republicans Attorney General across this country is to be able to say that we stand for the Constitution and the rule of law. And so when we filed that lawsuit, it was about the fact that it was initiated by an executive order during the Obama administration, not allowing for Congress to act in the role that they were designed to be the legislative authority of our immigration policy. We stood up and said that's wrong. And we look forward to being able to continue that case going forward, not again as a way to somehow or another end DACA as a program, but to instead say as a country and immigration policy, if that's the direction that we want to go, then Congress needs to act. The people of Alabama have seen that I'm a rule of law lawyer. We stood up against gambling in this state because gambling is illegal. The Alabama Constitution is very clear. Our Alabama Supreme Court has said that electronic bingo is illegal. But yet when I walked into the door, there were 9 facilities in this state that were operating illegally and against our Constitution. Local authorities weren't willing to act. My job was not to advance a policy believing that somehow or another I was an advocate against illegal gambling, but instead it was my role and responsibility as Attorney General to enforce the law. And despite many who would say that was a very dumb political decision, it was the right decision under the law. And we're continuing to enforce those cases around the state. I highlight those 2 issues particularly because it shows the very Attorney General that I have been and what I will continue to do is to be able to stand up for our Constitution, not only in this state, but around the country as well. We stood up for religious liberty when we've been able to stand with a clinic in Baltimore, who they required to be able to give information to those women who came to get an ultrasound to tell them where also they could go get an abortion. And we said that was wrong, and the court agreed with us, just like we're now fighting that same battle in California. We stood up for the city of Pensacola to be able to say, for that cross that you've had in your park for 26 years, that's lawful and that's constitutional, to be able to stand with them in that particular fight. To be able to stand with a city council in North Carolina who believe they need to be able to pray before they began their session, and for us to be able to say that that was a constitutional and lawful act. Not again doing anything other than being able to stand for the rule of law and for the Constitution and ensuring we were able to have that voice for Alabama. I look forward tonight to having a very substantive discussion about the vision and role of Attorney General and to be able to share with you my plans going forward. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Martin, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Alice Martin, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I don't know if anyone else got nervous when I went under the arches and realized it was May and this is exam time. I don't know about y'all, but I got a little nervous. Alan, thank you for hosting this and moderating tonight, and for the Federalist Society. When the agenda first came out, it listed me by my maiden name. So that may be an indication of when I joined the Federalist Society, because I got married in 1988, and I believe it started in 1986. So it is nice to be a member of this chapter. I have served for 37 years as a practicing lawyer, and I think distinctly different from my colleagues on stage is that I have done as much work in the civil arena as I have in the criminal. And that's very important, because your Attorney General is not only your chief law enforcement officer, but they're the chief civil litigator for the state of Alabama. And I think that's very important to have that experience. I have 27 years, as I said, practicing law, and 25 of that has been focused as a federal, state, and a local prosecutor. I'm a conservative, and that's one of the reasons, as a constitutional conservative, that I joined the Federalist Society very early on. I believe in limited government. I believe in states' rights. I believe that we have to protect and defend the Constitution, our religious freedoms, our traditional family values. And I have been one heartbeat away from the Attorney General, and have served in the office of Attorney General for the state of Alabama, helping to run that for General Strange longer than anyone on the stage. So I too have made those decisions along with him to whether or not we want to fight back, in fact we did, against the transgender bathroom mandate and the joining in of many multi-state cases to try to support a conservative interpretation of the law. The three things that I want to focus on as Attorney General, and I'd say the 3 C's that I'm running, are to defend and preserve the Constitution, and it is the tip of the spear and the last line of defense for the state against federal overreach and against the improper interpretation, if you will, of the rule of law and the Constitution. The second C is corruption. Alabama is rated by some as the #1 most corrupt state. I know that when I served as the United States Attorney for George W. Bush, that I formed the North Alabama Public Corruption Task Force that served and carried forth that mission for the top 31 counties of Alabama, representing 60% of the population. And over a period of 8 years, we convicted 140 officials of public corruption that stole millions from this state, not only out of its purse, but out of its integrity. I was disappointed to see the weak stance on the ethics bill this year by our legislature and kicking the can down the road rather than taking a strong stand to start doing the work the people want done, especially the loophole that's created now for principals and lobbyists if they call themselves economic developers that was created by HB 317. Corruption will be a focus of my administration, and I will build up the Special Prosecutions Division, not let it be eroded, as has occurred over the last 12 months. The third is community and children's safety. As a mother of 3, as a former registered nurse graduating from Vanderbilt and working as a registered nurse during law school, I understand keenly the mental health issues that we have. The jails are not mental facilities, the difficulties we have, and that more needs to be spent in that regard in the state of Alabama. I also understand keenly that our Medicare is really hurting. It's hurting the state's budget. I have fought for a False Claims Act that would help to restore and return monies that are improperly being taken in claims to no avail at this point, but it will be a top priority. So in closing, I would say that the significant difference is the civil and criminal experience and the platform. We can talk about violent crime, we can talk about human trafficking and opioids, and all of those things will be dealt with. And you need an executive leader. I'm the only person on the stage that has led government law firms, both federal and state, for 10 of my 37 years. And that experience is significant because so much can be done through multi-state and multi-jurisdictional task force and working together. The strategic plan for reduction of crime in Alabama is possible with appropriate planning and leadership. I look forward to leading that charge with the help of Republican voters that will select our candidate on June the 5th.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to the university for having us, and thanks to the Federalist Society for hosting. I'm a long-term member of the Federalist Society, and I've had a wonderful professional experience from being involved. A little bit about my biography. I'm a 47-year-old lawyer from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm married to another lawyer. We have 2 beautiful daughters, and we live a very happy life. When I got out of law school from the University of Alabama in '97, I went to Washington, D.C. just hoping to get a job like everybody that age does. What I got was really blessed. I worked for a senator named Jesse Helms, who was then the tip of the spear in the culture wars before even anybody had coined the phrase culture wars. And so we learned how to do two things. Number one, to disagree without being disagreeable, which I think is somewhat of a lost art. And number two, to hold the line on conservative causes and on principles. What I learned was that you can always negotiate on procedure. You can never, ever negotiate on principle. And so some of the things we did in the Helms Senate office were we kept people from taking bullets after they tried to take our guns. They went for the bullets. We stopped that. We kept them from discriminating against the Boy Scouts of America, who oddly had a name change today. And we did other things like that. I was really blessed, though. The election of 2000, I got sent down to Florida, where I was involved in the Gore v. Bush case. I was lucky to be sent, of all places, Broward County, which wound up being the one county that mattered. I then worked for W, which was a wonderful experience. After 9/11, I came home and I got into private practice, and I settled down and got married and had kids and had a lovely life. Being that I was in Birmingham, I had a couple of cases that came along that were tangentially involved with the bankruptcy, and it brought me back into somewhat of a governmental type focus. I served as a criminal court judge for a municipality up in Blount County, where I saw drug cases, I saw domestic violence cases, and a whole lot of run-of-the-mill cases as well. Proudly did that job, set the court back on a great budgetary path, and along those lines, at some point I was having a conversation with Senator Sessions, then Senator Sessions, who said, hey, I need you to work a statewide campaign. Would you like to do that? And being that it's Alabama, I assume we were talking about a governor's race. And I said, sure, but I didn't ask and he didn't tell. And 2 weeks later, Trump Tower called. So early summer 2015, I get hired. I met President Trump when he was wearing jeans and a cotton polo. I knew him right away to be an intelligent man, a fun man to hang out with, but most of all, a worker. And he told me point blank, I will outwork everybody on this campaign on my side and on Hillary's side every single day. And I mean it. And I'm pretty sure he did. Fast forward to after we win, I'm at work. I was given a bunch of Obama executive orders, and they said, Chess, figure out what you're going to do with these. And I said, great. It was the best job I'd had in a long, long time, just watching all of that burn to the ground. Here's what happened. I get a phone call from Montgomery, and it says, Chess, this is Governor Bentley's office. Would you like to come in and interview for the appointment to Attorney General? And I was shocked. I didn't look for it, but I said no. And they reiterated, we hear you want to do this job. And I said, I do. That's why I can't take the meeting, because I don't want to have to recuse from the public corruption cases, but thanks and no thanks. So when I came home, I got settled in. I was in my office in Birmingham. And we got a call, my wife and I did. And it was somebody who impressed upon me the need to have a candidate in this race who had said no to public corruption recently. And so we prayed on it, we thought on it, we slept on it, and we got in. And my wife is actually all in. She's at an event in Birmingham right now representing the campaign. But we are in because we think it's time that you had somebody to vote for who literally said no to public corruption. And the greatest indicator of the choices people are going to make is the choices they just did. And I'm going to say no to public corruption in the future, because what this state needs is for us to turn the page on public corruption and get behind it completely, because we got bigger problems. We are number 3 in the murder rate. Our violent crime stats are off the charts, and our drug sales are terrible. Lastly, what I'd like to do is use the office to fight against 8 years of regulations and 50+ years of U.S. Supreme Court decisions that didn't go our way. I think it's very important that we start injecting some sort of traditional American values back into our system after watching them leach out of it for so long. Again, I look forward to the question and answer. Thank you for having me. I'm Chess Bedsole.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Faulkner and Jones School of Law, Federalist Society, for including me in this forum. My name is Chris Christie. I am the original Chris Christie, born 3 years before the one in New Jersey who's tried to take my name. I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. I went off to school, married my wife, Donna Christie, who's here tonight. When I graduated from law school, my wife and I joined the Peace Corps. We went to Cameroon, West Africa. She worked at the National Center for Rehabilitation of the Handicapped, and I taught law at the University of Yaoundé School of Law. When we finished our Peace Corps service, we returned to my home. We returned to Alabama, where I worked for Bradley Arant, the law firm in Birmingham, Alabama, for 30 years. I left Bradley January 1st to run for Attorney General. Now, while I was at Bradley, I did three things. I mostly represented pension plans, employee benefit plans. Retirement Systems of Alabama was a client of mine. I also represented healthcare providers. I actually, over the last 6 years, spent most of my time working on False Claims Act cases. And in addition to that, I was chair of the law firm's pro bono committee and did a lot of pro bono work. An example I can give is I had a federal judge call me. The federal judge had filed in front of her a handwritten complaint, and that complaint said that one of the men had been in his top bunk. The SWAT team had been called in. The warden and the SWAT team came into the dorm, pulled him off the bunk, threw him on the ground, beat him so bad that they brought a wheelchair to take him to the healthcare unit. There was a camera recording all of this. They couldn't put him in the wheelchair. He had been beaten so bad, so they had to go get a stretcher, and then they took him to the healthcare unit. Well, the film of that got lost, and so the judge felt like that case warranted having a lawyer appointed for him, and I handled that. That's just one of a dozen different cases similar to that I've handled or supervised younger lawyers handling. Through that, I've interviewed correctional officers, prisoners, wardens, and taken their testimony under oath. I understand the problems with our prisons in Alabama. We have the worst prisons in the country. As a matter of fact, I visited prisons in Cameroon. I would rather be a prisoner in a third world country than be a prisoner in the state of Alabama. You know, we call public safety has two parts. It's crime and corrections. And the two interact here. We do such a bad job running our prisons that we don't keep the most dangerous prisoners in prisons. The correctional officers are overwhelmed. They can't do their jobs because of the mental health patients that are there and because of the overcrowding. And as a consequence, when a prisoner comes up to be released, not only have those prisoners not had their sentence extended, but they also have not had the administrative records kept to know that that prisoner's been raping other prisoners or stabbing other prisoners. And so those most dangerous prisoners, the ones that we all agree should be kept in prison, are released. We are losing on both sides. Part of the reason our prisons are so overcrowded is we have so many nonviolent offenders in prison. I had a young man come up to me after I was talking, and he told me that when he was 21 years old, he was 29 at the time, when he was 21 years old, he was arrested for marijuana possession. He didn't have any prior convictions, didn't even have any prior arrests. He got convicted of a felony for possession of something that in some states is legal, in almost all states is only a misdemeanor, and got a 9-year sentence. He served 7 of those years. And what did he learn during those 7 years in prison? He probably mostly learned how to avoid those other prisoners who were trying to make a victim of him, and if anything else, he would have learned how to be a criminal. We are losing on both ends. The state of Alabama is losing because we're locking people up, spending $20,000 a year to keep them locked up, instead of having those people be tax-paying citizens. Mass incarceration. And let me tell you, I'm looking around this crowd, and I'll tell you, most of the people who are in our prisons don't look like every person in this room. And there's a real problem. We didn't pass the racial profiling bill that was recently in the legislature. That is something that we need to address in the state of Alabama. Now, again, my name is Christie. You know, the other issues besides public safety, which is crime and corrections, that I intend to address is public corruption. And the public corruption in Alabama is worse than everybody here thinks it is. We are the most corrupt state. And so if we're going to do something about public corruption, we need new leadership in Alabama. And that's why I'm running to be Alabama's Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to enter our question and answer session, so if I could have the timer set to 2 minutes, thank you. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to the question, and the order of the first question, the order of response will go Christie, Chess Bedsole, Alice Martin, Steve Marshall, so an exact reverse order of what we just went. Question 1. Roughly 1 year ago, Richard Spencer, who identifies as a white nationalist, spoke at Auburn University, a public institution. A few months later, his appearance at the University of Virginia, another public institution, led to violence. In Charlottesville, 2 law enforcement officers and 1 local resident lost their lives during the rallies and protests provoked by Spencer's visit. What, if anything, should the Alabama Attorney General do to ensure that public universities in Alabama adhere to the requirements of the First Amendment while providing for the safety of students and others on campus? Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
You know, the First Amendment rights is one of our federal constitutional rights. The U.S. Constitution really is the supreme law of the United States. And so I do believe that people who have repugnant views, like Mr. Spencer, ought to be allowed to have a forum. But they don't need to be able to provide situations where you create dangers to others. You know, you're not allowed to yell fire in a theater and have people trample each other as they leave. Now, the difference between the 2 situations that you talked about, you know, one, you had an individual who wanted to come and express his views, and that's fine. The march that they had where there were people who were backing over other individuals who were counter-protesting is a different situation. And that is a situation where local law enforcement here in Alabama, the district attorney's office, ought to be able to prosecute those crimes that occurred. Now, district attorney's offices sometimes don't have the resources that they need, and the Attorney General's office will provide additional resources, and that's a very important role. I really, you know, frankly, I will tell you that that's not the kind of issue that I'm going to focus on as Attorney General. I'm going to focus on, again, 2 issues: mass incarceration and public corruption. And those are the issues that hold Alabama back. And I will again tell you that I'm looking forward to being Attorney General in the state of Alabama so we can start moving forward so that we're not last or almost last in every category that matters. Without good government, you're not going to have the state be able to advance, and without dealing with the public corruption we have in Alabama, we're not going to have good government. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
Thank you. You know, having worked on the Trump campaign, I can tell you I've been in a lot of tight spots where security was absolutely required. The president, out of the goodness of his own heart and out of his pocketbook too, decided that at some point that Secret Service was not adequate enough because they protected him, but they did not protect his staff. So he hired a private security firm, which we relied on throughout the course of the campaign for our own security, but also the security of people who wanted to come out and hear what he had to say. When you saw people get ejected from rallies on TV, that was private security, aided usually by local police forces. I think that the tragedy of places like Charlottesville and situations like that is really that there wasn't enough security on the ground to start out with to keep everybody safe. I'm a firm believer in the First Amendment. It bothers me that right after Charlottesville, I read a column, I believe, in the New York Times where somebody questioned, the author questioned, whether the United States and whether initially the younger people in the United States really have a stomach for it anymore. And the author questioned, is free speech dead? Do people not really want this anymore? Do we have a society of young people now that want to feel safe and feel included more than they want to be able to speak their minds? I hope that's not the case. It really bothers me for this country if we're going down that road. I would prefer that we keep everybody safe by allowing speech to be free, but providing the necessary security to keep people from taking it to the next level. And I think the Attorney General's office can absolutely assist the public universities in that. When there's going to be speakers of that caliber coming to campus, it would probably be a good idea to have a security meeting and involve all the law enforcement community in it so that there's adequate boots on the ground before somebody like that gets off the plane and comes to campus. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
Well, I'm certainly an advocate for the First Amendment, and it makes me think of a Ku Klux Klan member that came and spoke at Vanderbilt when I was a student there. But the question is interesting because it seems that you want to shift, or that it's a shifting of responsibility from the university, which is sponsoring an event on their campus and has a responsibility to do all they can to keep safe, to what will government do for you. And so I won't accept that shift, but we would certainly want to partner and be available if we could provide some resources as far as education and some past experiences in that regard.
Thank you. General Marshall.
Thank you. You know, as somebody that takes barbs from critics from time to time, you occasionally think that the First Amendment is overrated, but it's not. Our founding fathers established it for a very valid purpose, which was to allow us as Americans to be able the opportunity to have freedom of speech. And to the extent that we see any governmental entity, any educational institution attempt to abridge or censor that First Amendment right, that is definitely an interest for the Attorney General of Alabama, and we need to be proactive in making sure that we protect that guaranteed right. You know, sometimes in this country we see that there is an overreaction when we have extreme circumstances take place in wanting to somehow restrict the constitutional rights that exist. We take the tragic shooting in Parkland, for example, when some would then say that's a reason for controlling our guns, as opposed to understanding that this was somebody who simply wanted to be able to do evil and was going to do evil. We need to be very careful in any action that we take that otherwise would restrict what our founding fathers saw was instrumental for us to be able to have a country that was free and in which we could thrive. Now, law enforcement does have a function. When we know that there is potentially a very controversial speaker, we need to make sure that we plan appropriately, allow people to the extent they have a valid right to protest to be able to do that safely, and otherwise to be able to ensure public safety. But most importantly, we have to make sure the government does not intrude on those constitutional rights that we were guaranteed, especially ones like the freedom of speech.
Thank you very much. The order of response for the second question will go Chess Bedsole, Chris Christie, Steve Marshall, Alice Martin. The question is regarding civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is the legal process by which law enforcement seizes and sells property of suspected criminals who have not yet been convicted of a crime. According to the Institute for Justice, a nonprofit libertarian public interest law firm, Alabama's civil forfeiture laws are among the worst in the nation. FreedomWorks Foundation recently gave Alabama a grade of F for its civil asset forfeiture laws. How will your office approach civil asset forfeiture laws? Mr. Bedsole.
Thank you, Alan. Civil asset forfeiture laws, let me break it down into two pieces. There's the federal and there's the state portion. Jeff Sessions, General Sessions, recently weighed in on the federal side. I happen to agree with his thoughts there. On the Alabama side, I've read the study, and they basically had several problems with our current state's civil asset forfeiture laws. And you find kind of a mix of liberal groups and conservative groups who have issues with it. I don't endorse what some of the liberal groups want done to it, but I do think that there's a couple of good points made. One is that there is no auditing. There's no record of how much is taken and where that money goes. And I think that is something we should do better on. Secondly, the report complained that sometimes there's incentivization for local officers on the ground because they can, in fact, the same person who gets the money is the person who decides how it is spent. So one of the report indications was that we need to separate the person who obtains the cash versus the person who makes the spending decisions. Having said all that, and lastly, it also indicated in the report that not only do you not need to be convicted, you don't even have to be charged in this state, which is something the report brought out. I would say that, we need to update and modernize that, but we still need to have it because there are a lot of times when law enforcement pulls somebody over where it's very clear that what they're doing, what they're engaged in is drug activity. And you cannot let somebody engaged in that activity walk away with large sums of cash, because by the time you are able to get at that again, it will be gone and it will be used on illegal purposes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
Alabama's civil asset forfeiture laws are a problem. They need to be changed. They allow people to lose their property to the government without any due process, without any process at all. And that's not acceptable. Now, do you have to have a criminal conviction in order to take the property? Well, maybe not. I mean, so there are other states where they require hearings and the judges have to make findings. But in Alabama, we actually have the opposite. In other words, if you want to get your property back after it's seized, you have to bring an action. And the burden's on you to prove that you can get it back. And that's just not right. That's not the way government is supposed to work. Now, we're talking about a change in law, right? And to have changes in law, you got to go to the legislature. That is something that I've done in the past. I've worked with the legislature on some criminal justice reform matters that we've had. I've also worked with the legislature on passing laws that protect students in schools who have diabetes. And so both of those are areas where I have actually gone to the legislature, worked with them, and gotten laws passed. And I, as Attorney General, that will be a large part of what I intend to do. I intend to work with the legislature to make sure we have the laws that we need that protect people in all kinds of different ways. So again, the civil asset forfeiture laws in Alabama need to be changed, and they need to require due process before the government can keep someone's property. And I agree with Mr. Bedsole that you don't need to have the person who decides whether or not to take the law to be the person who also then gets to spend it. That does not make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. General Marshall, 2 minutes.
For 16 years, I ran a drug task force, and the direction to them was chase dope, not money, because they definitely needed to be two different areas and two different priorities. However, I support Alabama's civil asset forfeiture law as we have it now. One of the things that I've heard from the two speakers before, I don't necessarily agree with. I don't agree with Mr. Christie that there is no due process in our civil statute now. It does exist. It's incumbent upon the state of Alabama to establish the connection of those proceeds that are seized to somehow or another the proceeds of a crime. We have the burden, not the defendant. Mr. Bedsole talked about whether or not there needed to be a conviction. I'll give you an example. We have individuals that will transport drugs in hidden compartments in cars, but they will also transport money. I've been involved in situations where somebody was pulled over, where hundreds of thousands of dollars were involved in a vehicle that otherwise didn't have drugs. When that person was questioned, they didn't know the money was there. They claimed no knowledge that it was there, but they did say that they were carrying that money back to the cartel. That's proceeds of a drug operation that law enforcement needs to be able to activate through a forfeiture action to seize those proceeds so they don't make it to the folks who are engaging in drug activity in this country. You wouldn't have been able to charge that person with a crime, but there was a valid forfeiture action for us going forward. To the extent that there are abuses in our system, then we need to be able to investigate those. But yet there is a valid purpose for civil asset forfeiture, and we need to continue it in the state of Alabama.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
I have a great deal of experience in civil asset forfeiture and criminal forfeiture, of course, having served as a United States attorney and as assistant United States attorney for a total of 15 years, and also in the civil system in Alabama. I do think reform is needed. We do not want to have the issue of policing for profit, and that is some of the concern. I think we can do that by some minor reforms that will still allow there to be an action for civil forfeiture. However, you have some burden, and more burden than what has been described on the state. Here's an example. It's frequently that you'll stop somebody that's a courier that's headed back south with the money. They will walk away from the money. They won't come in and make a claim in civil court that they want the $40,000 that they didn't know anything about. They're going to walk away and say, I didn't know it was there. But a good example is the used car salesman that has sold a car in Alabama that has $10,000 in cash, and he's pulled over. And now they say, well, we don't know how you got this. It might be ill-gotten gains from an illegal action. And he says, no, it's from a car sale. And now he's put to the burden of proving the legitimacy of that transaction and that cash in his possession. And the cost of that sometimes to go into court. And in Alabama, we see the time that it takes him to do that is a burden that just should not be shifted. So I would agree with the report that we could make reforms that many other states have done, still leaving that option there for law enforcement to capture those proceeds that should be captured, but also give more due process to citizens.
Thank you. The order of response for question number 3 will be Alice Martin, Steve Marshall, Chris Christie, Ches Bedsole. According to Paul Nullett, a political science professor at Marquette University, the number of lawsuits brought by state attorneys general against the federal government increased from 3 in 1980 to 27 in 2017. Today, says Nullett, almost every time there's a major federal policy change, partisan groups of AGs will bring a challenge, and often an opposing group of AGs will intervene to defend the administration. Do you view this trend as a positive or a negative, and what do you believe the Attorney General should do when federal laws or regulations unconstitutionally encroach upon state sovereignty? Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
Well, when federal regulations unduly and improperly encroach upon states' rights, we ought to exercise that and go into court to fight for the 10th Amendment for states' rights. Certainly there has been an uptick in what is being called federal activism, and many people are saying, just as they did with the seminal first case was tobacco litigation, that state AGs are joining together to do through litigation what they can't do through legislation. They were able to force an industry of tobacco to make changes in how they function at a price that's pretty substantial and still pays out into this state over $100 million per year in perpetuity. So there certainly could be abuse, but at this point it is being used in some very appropriate ways as well.
Thank you. General Marshall, 2 minutes.
You know, Alan, I think we saw this really emerge from the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, in which liberal attorneys general began to be proactive in this area. I think there's a very difference between liberal AGs and conservative AGs is that we do it under the guise of federalism. Our principles are one of enforcing constitutional rights. It's very different than what our liberal AGs are doing in various areas. And DACA being that example that I can give you most recently. Our action this week against DACA was based solely and simply upon what the Constitution requires. That Congress should be the agency or the entity of government, the branch of government, to be able to establish immigration policy, not through an executive order of an administrative agency granting status to a certain group of individuals. We saw liberal courts in California and in New York and in Washington, D.C. respond against the administration's actions in being able to rescind that order in a very liberal and inappropriate way. Attorneys general have the ability to be engaged in issues that matter for the right reasons. The dusky gopher frog. None of y'all may know about that, but I do. As a result of the fact that through a change in the law during the Obama administration, there was a taking of up to $34 million in the state of Louisiana. Now, that didn't affect Alabama specifically, but the rule change did. And we had the opportunity to be able to reach out and ultimately prevail in that litigation so the Trump administration can now change that rule so it's consistent with the role of the particular agencies involved. We will continue to be proactive in the right way under Federalist principles to make sure that we have the opportunity to stand for the rule of law.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
As Attorney General, I'm not going to use the Attorney General's offices to go after these frivolous lawsuits that are filed against federal policies. That includes both the lawsuits that were filed against the Obama administration, and there's actually been an uptick. There's been an increase of those lawsuits filed against the Trump administration. People often ask me, are you going to have, as Attorney General, enough resources to be able to do the things that you want to do to improve the prisons, to improve public safety, to address public corruption? And the answer to that is yes, because I am not going to waste Alabama's resources on chasing these lawsuits that deal with federal issues. When somebody tells you that as a state attorney general that they're going to have an important role in addressing immigration law, don't trust them. Don't trust them, because it's a federal issue and the federal laws are going to take care of that, and all that's happening is you're wasting state resources chasing your tail. That's not what you need to be doing. Now, one of the prior answers involved chasing litigation like the tobacco litigation, and that is something that we ought to do. That actually brings resources to state government, and it's a help to both the state and to the people who've suffered. You know, we had the BP oil litigation was an example. We had the tobacco litigation. There's opioid litigation. And I will compliment Mr. Marshall because he has actually finally joined the opioid litigation. Alabama was the 41st state to join that. And those are the type of things that the Attorney General's office can do that are positive. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
Yes, actually, look, if I were great at math, I would not have been a lawyer. But I would love to know, since you quoted statistics on how many cases attorneys general have taken up regarding regulations, exactly what the explosion of regulations themselves were in that same amount of time, because I would suggest to you it's probably more, it's probably greater. As we have become a nation of regulations and rules, we have necessarily become a nation where attorneys generals get involved in the litigation of them. Being that the United States Constitution directly addresses the relationship between the federal government and the states. I view it as a natural extension that state attorneys general are involved in this and should be involved in this. And I would also counter that there is absolutely a resources game being played here, because there is a dollar cost of every one of those regulations and rules that are foisted upon us by Washington. And when people in this state and when this state's government have had enough, not only are they able to make a case against the federal government, but they should. In my opinion, I think it's part of the duty of the office. I think it's part of the duty of the office not only because of the state citizenry here, but also because of the interest in keeping America what it is that it should be, which in my opinion is a nation free of overburdensome regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. The order of response for the next question is Steve Marshall, Chris Christie, Alice Martin, Chess Bedsole. As Attorney General, under what circumstances would you recuse yourself from an investigation? As Attorney General, under what circumstances would you recuse yourself from an investigation? General Marshall, 2 minutes.
I think two circumstances, and one you've already seen that as a result of the nature of my appointment. There are very specific provisions under the Code of Professional Conduct in which lawyers need to recuse themselves from cases. And so there's an obligation as a practicing lawyer to comply with those particular restrictions. And so we would comply with those clearly in any decision that I would be involved with or any investigation would be involved with. But there's a secondary responsibility as well. There is a broader obligation under the rules promulgated through national district attorney standards that reflect prosecutors and when they should be involved in cases, which are not just when you have a direct conflict, but also when there's particularly the appearance in which you may be biased against or for one of the particular parties. Robert Bentley appointed me as Attorney General of Alabama. 2 days after I received that appointment on a Friday, actually 3 days, on a Tuesday morning, I learned that there was an investigation of the governor. At that point in time, I recused myself from that investigation. Not because the rules of professional conduct in Alabama would have required it. In fact, I talked to the bar and they said it wouldn't. Instead, it was so the people of Alabama could have trust that going forward, that investigation would be handled professionally and appropriately. We appointed Ellen Brooks, a tough, respected prosecutor in the state of Alabama, to handle that investigation, and pleased that she was able to do that for us going forward. But in any case coming in the future, and I'm not recused from anything else, those would be the two standards that we would apply in whether or not I would continue.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
There are two situations where a lawyer needs to recuse themselves, and an attorney general really should do the same type of thing. One situation is when there's a direct conflict, and that would arise in a situation where you were working on a matter before you became attorney general, and as became attorney general, there was a problem. An example I can give you is the Retirement Systems of Alabama was my client for a couple decades, and UAB Hospital and the Kirkland Clinic were my client for a couple of decades. If there was a matter that arose while I was Attorney General that involved what had been going on while they were my client, I would recuse myself. Now, if it was a matter that arose after I became Attorney General, I would not have the same duty to accuse myself. But there is this additional layer, the second reason, which is the appearance of impropriety. And if there was a question about the appearance of impropriety, I agree that that is also a situation where somebody should recuse themselves. So those are the two situations that someone would need, a lawyer would need to recuse themselves, and the Attorney General as a lawyer would need to recuse himself in those two situations.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
Well, I think my colleagues before me have already outlined what the bar requires and the rules of professional conduct and that of appearances of impropriety. And so those would be the things that would guide me as well. I will say that I think sometimes prosecutors will recuse to get out of the heat. And I saw that certainly when I was a chief deputy attorney general, and some district attorneys would want to recuse things, and they would say, you know, now a witness is upset with us. We've talked to them and they're upset, and so we all come in and take the case. So I will not be one that runs from the kitchen when it gets hot, you know, when a case is very heated. But the rules are there and they're clear for us. And we do have the ability, if you ever have a question about that, of course, to go to the bar to ask for clarification.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
I can't really add on that. I'll just incorporate by reference everything my colleagues have said, and I agree with Alice in regards to heat, too. I wouldn't run from it either. And that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, order of response, will be Chess Bedsole, Alice Martin, Chris Christie, Steve Marshall. The question is, what is the appropriate relationship between the governor's office and the attorney general's office? Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
Sure. Okay. Without getting too deep into the Constitution, the governor has certain legal authorities. In the Riley era, the Supreme Court made clear that the governor had final decision on certain legal matters. Other than those particular matters, I think the Attorney General's role is very clear. I don't intend to be trying to be the governor. I'm running for this job so that I can be the Attorney General, which means focusing on the business of the state, showing up early, staying late, and managing the bejesus out of the situation in between. We have got a lot of cases that require a lot of attention on a daily basis. And I think the greatest thing you can do as Attorney General is simply show up and do the job and do it with a conscious heart and the right spirit. But so far as the governor's role, best left to the governor. Thanks.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
Well, they are distinctly different roles, of course, the governor and the AG, but there is a relationship in that when I served as a chief deputy, I did meet on a regular basis with then David Byrne, who was the governor's legal counsel. And because you are the chief litigator for the state, and you have civil litigations, which will oftentimes result, I should say, in settlements, you may want to talk to the governor about the exposure that they have on a case. So just as you would any client, you're going to consult and tell them what that is. Certainly when we've had litigation that involved UACAVA with the voters' rights and issues that we had with our Uniform and Veterans Voting Act, we needed to consult with the governor to tell him what we would need to have changed, just as we consulted with the Secretary of State. So they are agency heads that represent and are often parties listed in the litigation. So as you would any client, you're going to want to have conversations with them about that. So that, I think, is the role that I experience.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
The relationship between the governor's office and the attorney general's office has been a matter of litigation within the last several years. My law firm actually represented the Riley administration in establishing that the governor's office actually has a role in determining what the legal enforcement efforts are going to be in the state. On the other hand, the Attorney General is separately elected. He's not appointed by the governor like the U.S. Attorney General is appointed by the President. And so there is a real separation and a real role for the Attorney General to play that's separate from the governor's office. And so my own view is that how those two roles interact with each other is still being worked out. Again, we had this litigation over who was going to take over enforcement of the laws in a certain area, and the Alabama Supreme Court did rule that the governor, when he felt like it was necessary, could step in and establish a task force that did try to enforce the laws that he didn't feel like that the Attorney General's office was handling in an adequate way. So the answer is, as Attorney General, I'm going to do what needs to be done, working with the legislature to change the laws, enforcing the laws, representing the different departments and agencies, recognizing that there is another executive who has some role also, which is the governor.
Thank you. General Marshall, 2 minutes.
Maybe if Troy King were here, he could have answered about this question with Cornerstone, since that was very much relevant to a discussion going on with gambling. I am an independent constitutional officer from the governor. I don't work for the governor of the state of Alabama. I work for the people of the state of Alabama. Having said that, I have a wonderful collaborative relationship with our governor's office right now because we should be partners in issues going forward. But on the issue of gambling, I think you've seen a clear distinction between the administration that Ms. Martin was in with the Attorney General's office and where I am. Robert Bentley issued an executive order relating to gambling in this state, basically deferential to local authorities. And although what was going on was illegal during the time that General Strange was there, the Attorney General's office took no action, although local officials likewise took no action. That same executive order is still in place today. We did not defer to that executive order. In fact, we understood our responsibility was to be able to enforce the law. That's one example where I will be independent of the governor, at the same time recognizing that on most issues, we will be lockstep going forward on behalf of the people of the state.
Thank you. The order of response for the next question: Alice Martin, Steve Marshall, Chess Bedsole, Chris Christie. Writing in AL.com today, Kyle Whitmire decried the practice whereby sheriffs keep and retain as personal income any surplus in the food service allowance for feeding prisoners. He poses the following question in his article: are jail food funds subject to public records request, or are those funds the sheriff's public money? Mrs. Marshall, 2 minutes.
Martin.
Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
Yes, as it was reported in the AL.com, I don't view these funds as the sheriff's personal funds. There was an opinion issued by then Bill Pryor, Attorney General Bill Pryor, that said that. Then Attorney General King in 2008 issued a contrary AG's opinion that referenced a Department of Public Examiner's memo, and he said he thought they could. And then Attorney General Luther Strange issued an opinion in 2011 saying it was not the personal funds that could be kept by the sheriffs. And if anybody's confused by all this, of course, the Attorney General issues Attorney General opinions. It's one of the most important functions they have. And cities and counties and state agencies can ask for opinions and then can rely on that legal guidance, and it gives them some comfort in moving forward and some protections in court if they act accordingly, if they've provided all the facts. So what we have, unfortunately, in Alabama is a practice sometimes of not retiring and rescinding prior Attorney General's decisions. So it appears that the sheriffs have hung their hat on 2008's opinion by King that they could keep it, whereas I think the 2011 made it very clear that they could not. So I think the practice is very questionable after the 2011 opinion that was issued by General King at the time. And of course, I did answer in that, as I would answer today, that I believe those records are public records and should be viewed. These are public funds that are cut by the finance department that go to the sheriff's department. And I do not think the nature of that funding being public and publicly available because it's business records changes.
Thank you. General Marshall, 2 minutes.
Ms. Martin, I disagree on her interpretation of the series of AG's opinions. 2008, General King at that point in time made it very clear that excess funds were the personal funds of the sheriff. The 2011 opinion was specifically interpreting a local act that dealt with that in a particular area and not broadly relating to the opinion in 2008. So it was very specific. To the extent that Brenda Smith, who wrote that opinion, who also wrote the 2008 opinion, believed that these were inconsistent, then she could have referenced the 2008 opinion and said that it was overruled. It wasn't. And so the sheriffs were appropriate in relying upon that 2008 decision to the extent that there was not a contrary local law. The broader question really is, do we want to continue this practice in the state of Alabama? But yet the Attorney General doesn't have the authority to determine that. That is based upon the laws of the legislature. I've heard from many sheriffs around this state that they would not want the burden of having to feed inmates for $1.75 per day per inmate. And in fact, they would welcome our county commissions to be able to take over that responsibility. Ultimately, that's a policy call for our legislature going forward. But as it relates to the public records aspect of this, to the extent that that money is distributed to a sheriff in a public account and expenditures are made from that public account, it is a public record. But if it is given to a personal fund of the sheriff in the way that they distribute that money locally, then that is in their personal account. It would not be subject to an open records request.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I would have to agree with Steve. My read on both the 08 and the 11 Attorney General opinions were that they were separate in issues and underlying issues. I've also want to say something else on this. I think that what's lost in this are the sheriffs themselves. I've spoken to a lot of these gentlemen who are trying very hard to do a very difficult job. They have taken out, at times, personal loans. These folks are married. They have to go home and explain that to their spouses and have a family conversation about taking out a loan to cover the feeding of people for 2 months before they are reimbursed for that by the state. If you look at the actual day-to-day system that's in place, it's embarrassing. We are basically foisting government responsibilities onto people who firmly believe that they have personal liability for this and that they feel, in a lot of cases, alone. The reason why more county commissions, I'm told by the sheriffs, have not voted to take over these responsibilities is because they don't enjoy the immunity that a sheriff's office does, and they are afraid of the litigation costs that they would incur by being regularly sued by people who stay in the jail. I think that all of these issues mean that there needs to be an overarching legislative reform of the system. I don't think that you can do it any other way. And I am very concerned about it because it's actually a much uglier process than I knew about before I really delved into it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 2 minutes.
The most important issue here is the horrible food that was being served to these inmates. That really should be the focus of what we're talking about. The law is wrong. The law incentivizes a sheriff to provide inadequate food to people who need to eat, and that is what needs to change. We need to not have those types of incentives. I believe that most sheriffs try to do their job well despite the incentives, but it's wrong when you have incentives that would allow someone to basically abuse prisoners that are given into their care in order to how they feed them. Now, part of what the article really focused on was the Open Records Act requests that involved these same issues. And I encourage people to read not only the first AL.com article, but there were 2 additional articles today. And I would encourage y'all to read those 2 articles also. But it is going to require, I believe, a legislative change in order to fix this problem. I do agree that the 2011 opinion Attorney General's opinion was limited in scope. And so unfortunately, we have a law in Alabama, surprise, that doesn't work the way that you would hope a law would work. Thank you.
Thank you. The response for the final question is, the response order is going to be Chris Christie, Chess Bedsole, Steve Marshall, Alice Martin. The final question is, all 3 branches of government in Alabama have suffered political scandal in recent years. As Attorney General, what steps will you take to restore the public trust? Mr. Christie.
Alabama had its governor, its Speaker of the House, who was probably the most powerful person in the state at the time, and its Chief Justice, all removed under a cloud. That really is part of what drove me to decide to run for Attorney General. I was having my devotional one morning, and I went in after having prayed and went in and told my wife, it's time. We had been going to some social events, and people have been asking, why can't we get good people to run for office in Alabama? And so instead of talking about it, I decided to do something. It's going to take integrity. It's going to take someone who's going to lead the state of Alabama. It's going to take someone who can convince the legislature to pass ethics laws that people can understand. It's going to take effort to get people to comply with those ethics laws. You know, my role as Attorney General is not going to be saying how many people, how many government officials I can put in jail. My role will be to make sure that people comply with the laws. First, you've got to have a law that's strong and is understandable, and then you got to educate people about what the law is. Most people want to comply with the law. Those who are not going to comply, then you take actions to make sure that there are consequences. So as Attorney General, my role will be both making sure we have the laws that we need, making sure people are educated about those laws, and when people still then don't comply with those laws, to make sure we take actions so that there are consequences to those who refuse to obey the laws that we have.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I agree we have an ethics problem in this state. I think first and foremost, I'd like to mention 3 things. First and foremost, I think you ought to lead by example. I think that you ought to say no to bad ideas and give it a firm no. I think you ought to live your life completely outside the bounds of any questionable activity. I'm a firm believer in that. It has kept me through some very dark times when I could have gotten in trouble, But I had the first boss I ever had, a guy named Jesse Helms in the Senate that I referenced earlier. He told me something great as a kid coming out of law school, and this is what he said. He said, Chess, let me tell you something. When the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that's when you know you need to get up out of the room and leave because somebody might go to jail. And I've never forgotten that. So that's the first thing, lead by example. Secondly, I am very concerned about our ethics situation in this state, our ethics commission, our ethics laws. I think they need some restructuring. I think there needs to be reform. And I think the greatest thing an AG can do in regards to the ethics commission is lead that reform and help the legislature come to a process that works. I think it's pretty obvious that the processes we have in place don't really function the way maybe people intended them to. I've been filing ethics returns now for years and years. I'm always worried that I might be compliant the day I file them, and maybe the commission meets over the summer and reverses themselves 180 degrees, and then we're all not compliant anymore. I've got a second law degree in taxation. Compliance really matters to me. I don't want to live a life that's in the gray. I just don't. And I don't want anybody else to have to wonder either, because it's too much of a burden on our system. And lastly, I think when people are determined not to be compliant, you owe it to the taxpayers, you owe it to the people who live their lives the right way inside the boundaries to put those people in jail. Thanks.
Thank you. General Marshall, 2 minutes.
Part of the question had to do with people's faith and trust in government. And so candidly, it starts with me, is that when I have traveled around the state, especially right after I was appointed, talked to people about what it is they expected of me. What did they want to see us do in the Attorney General's office? And sadly, many of the responses were, just don't embarrass us. Just don't embarrass us. You know, that's a sad standard if that's what many seek to hold us to. And I say for everybody that's on this stage, I don't believe that they are people that believe that we should violate that standard. In fact, we should be held to a higher standard. When I was district attorney, I had a prosecutor who came to me kind of complaining, saying that people expect more of me than they do of somebody else that's not in public service. And my response to him was, don't be in public service. That if you're not willing to hold yourself out as an example for others, then don't agree to serve in public. Second thing is, then I think both of the previous speakers have said it, is that we need to continue to work on the ethics laws that exist in this state. You know, beginning on May 17th, we'll begin that process to look at reform in Alabama, which should deal with transparency, should deal with strength, and it should deal with clarity. And going forward, I look forward to the opinions of many being able to look at our current law, being able to examine situations in the past where we believe that there are holes or there are need for changes, and to be able to bring together a package that makes sense for the state of Alabama.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 2 minutes.
I believe from having experience having prosecuted the mayor of Birmingham, 4 of the 6 Jefferson County commissioners over the Jefferson County sewer scandal, prosecuting the person that was largely responsible for the bond swap scandal that led eventually to the bankruptcy of Jefferson County, that what the people tell me is that the way you help to restore their trust and faith in government is by them seeing the government work for them and enforcing laws against people that they see as politically elite and special interests connected. So in the federal government, we had such an advantage to the state prior to 2010 in that we had tools in our toolbox: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. And we worked collaboratively with then Attorney General Bill Pryor to bring those cases because Alabama had such weak laws. Then in 2010, Alabama strengthened their laws, only this last session to see them weakened once again. You know, I was able to bring about reform, I think, in part because of the 2-year college scandal with Chancellor Roy Johnson, several state senators, legislators, that ended the practice of double dipping. And I previously served as a chief ethics and compliance officer for a multi-state hospital management company. And what we saw there was that the employees want to know that the leaders are following the rules as well. You need to have training. It should go beyond what our Ethics Commission currently does. And you need to have accountability by bringing people to justice when they have violated those rules. You will restore truth or faith in your government when they see the government working for them. Every day that I'm on the campaign trail for the last 10 months, I have people talk about corruption, be it at the city, the county, or the state level. They want to see action. They want to see action. And I will lead a strong, clear ethics reform on taking office.
Thank you. At this time, each candidate will be allowed 3 minutes for a closing statement, and we'll return to the order in which we began. So that would be Steve Marshall, Alice Martin, Chess Bedsole, and Christie. General Marshall, 3 minutes for closing statements.
You know, I was struck a little bit about different visions that you heard up here. And one of the things that Mr. Christie said really struck me about the role of attorneys general, and specifically in litigation outside of the state of Alabama, and whether or not that was a waste of resources. You know, I don't consider it a waste of resources to try to fight against dismemberment abortion. I don't find it a waste of resources for me to be able to stand with a printer outside of Alabama who doesn't want to print items that he believes are against his religious beliefs. I don't think it's a waste of state resources to be able to help support a baker who said that he didn't want to bake a cake that's against his religious beliefs. I don't think it's a waste of state resources to stand up against the city of San Diego who wants to unduly restrict Second Amendment rights. I think our ability to impact issues that are affected by the Constitution are the very role and function that we've had. You know, one of the things that I've done is to try to study attorneys general over the years, to see the role and the function that they believe they've played, and how it is that I can adopt or in some ways reject the philosophy that they had. Bill Pryor truly set the standard of what I think an attorney general in Alabama should be, the issues that we should be involved with, and what it is that we should ultimately stand for. I'm very proud of the record that we have. It's out there for people to be able to review, to evaluate, and at some point, I guess, criticize. But I think what you have seen is that we have stood on principle, that we have stood on the Constitution, and that we will continue to be an Attorney General's office as long as I'm there that supports and enforces the rule of law. It's been the greatest professional privilege I've ever been given to be able to serve you in this capacity. In one way, because you allow me to be able to work with my heroes, and that's the men and women of law enforcement who every day protect us. To be able to continue to be that voice for victims throughout Alabama that otherwise don't always feel like they've had that voice. But also you've been able to give me the opportunity to be the voice of Alabama outside of our borders, to be able to stand for those issues that matter, and to be able to uphold our Constitution, not just here in this state, but around this country as well. I appreciate the opportunity I've been given over the last seemingly 11 months to be able to share a vision with the people of the state of Alabama. We'll continue to be able to do that for the next 34 days, and I look forward to June 5th to be able to be the Republican nominee going forward and to eventually be elected as Attorney General of Alabama.
Thank you. Mrs. Martin, 3 minutes.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with each of you tonight. I too believe that there are many cases in which we join as members of the Republican Attorney General's Association in litigation that has significance in protecting and defending traditional family values, constitutional freedoms, religious freedoms, and we've all talked about that. But I do think it is not an appropriate resource, and I think it is a waste to hire outside counsel to represent this great state in the opioid litigation. You know, when General King was in office, he signed a contract with outside firms to litigate on the BP. That was canceled by a subsequent attorney general that came in, and I'm told it saved approximately $134 million for the state of Alabama that went to the general fund. So that's very important, and I think because I have worked with the men and women of the Attorney General's office for 2 years, that they can do that litigation, that it's not necessary that we hire plaintiffs' counsel to do that and outsource that work of the state. I also think it's critical that in 2016, had we not earned an attorney fee of $10,000 from representing the state of Alabama in the BP litigation settlement, and importantly, we were the only state that had the coastal damage that did represent ourselves. Had we not had that attorney fee, we were looking at a layoff of about 28 people in the Attorney General's office because it's only funded about 40% from the general fund. So it's very important that while we have these other things to go on, that we look at strengthening the Consumer Affairs Division of the Attorney General's office. And when I was there as Chief Deputy, we tripled the resources that were there for the attorneys and added investigators there. And that's the kind of division that brought about the settlement of BP, that brought about the settlement of the Volkswagen emissions case for the state's citizens. And it's the kind of unit that could do the opioids as it has other cases. So I think it's very important to realize that that work does not need to be outsourced. Again, my platform is the 3 C's: defending and preserving the Constitution, the fight of corruption. I'm the only person on this stage that has done that over an extremely long period of time for their career, and I will work hard to make sure that we, the people, can have trust and integrity restored to the government for us through strong ethics laws that are clear to businessmen who large and by far want to obey the laws. We need more transparency in the statement of economic interest form that Chess referenced earlier, that we all as employees or people that are running for office have to do. And third is your community and public safety. I look forward to working for the state. Thank you. Alice Martin.
Thank you. Mr. Bedsole, 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I agree with you, Alice. I think this statement of economic interest form should be strengthened, and I think the ranges should be tightened. Having said that, you know, one of the things that I got to do, just by the grace of God, was work in Washington not once but twice. And I consider myself an Alabama guy. I was born and raised here. It's always my home. It's always where I come back to. But it's pretty miraculous that I got to do that twice, given that I live here. The second time around, the real benefit that you can get from a job like that is when you have the 40,000 foot down view of crime and of statistics, and you look across the United States and you see what the states do well and you see what the states don't do well. And the benefit of that is you can see what Alabama does well and you can see where it's lacking. What Alabama does well is this: we have the finest on-the-ground law enforcement professionals that you could ever hope to have. These people do it because it's a calling, because it's personal to them. Their families are all in their careers. It is something special to see. And I've seen it up close and personal on the ground. It shows up in the stats you see in D.C. You see these people over and over again working long hours, a lot of overtime to get the job done. What I see also from D.C., when you compare Alabama with other states, and we are ranked number 3 in the nation for murder. We are bested only by Illinois because of Chicago and Louisiana because of New Orleans. Now, what you see there is a frightening lack of leadership and resources, and also, to a lesser degree, equipment and training. And these are all things that Montgomery should be doing to support the guys that are on the ground, the ladies and gentlemen who do this job every day. I take that very personally. I take it very seriously. A good example is Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, sits on $2 billion a year in grant funds that are given solely for law enforcement purposes. Now, if you divide that by 50 states, we should be looking at an average of $40 million a year. If you look at it by population, we should be closer to 50. I don't think we get our fair share. And the reason why, it took me some time to find out, is in order to get grant money, you have to write grants and you have to apply for them and tell what you're going to spend that money on. And to do that, you got to have a plan. And I think the biggest problem we have in the fighting of crime in this state is that we don't have a statewide plan that is developed in the local areas where people know what their problems are. And then it's supported at a higher level with resources, with coordination, and with help. That's what means the most to me. I'm Chess Bedsole. I'd love your vote on June the 5th. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Christie, 3 minutes.
Thank you. Alabama is last in public safety. Alabama has the highest infant mortality rate in the country. Alabama has the highest diabetes rate in the country. We are last or almost last in every category that matters. If we had a football team that year after year was last or almost last, what would we do? We would fire the coach. And we would set up a head coach search team that would try to find someone with the experience and success who could lead, and so that we would have a winning program. All right, well, why should I be the Attorney General for the state of Alabama? It's because of my qualifications, my experience, and my heart. In 2017, there was a survey of the lawyers in Alabama, 14,000 practicing lawyers in Alabama, and they chose 50 top attorneys in the state. I was one of those top 50 attorneys. Alabama deserves one of the best lawyers in Alabama as its attorney general. I worked at a law firm that when I first started working there permanently, there were 80 lawyers. And when I left in January, there were 550 lawyers. I have supervised more lawyers than about 80 lawyers and 100 staff that the Attorney General's office supervises. I worked at one of the best private companies in Alabama, my law firm. If you believe that you can take the skills that someone has running a private enterprise and apply it to government, I'm the person you're going to choose to be Attorney General. In addition to both my qualifications and my skills is my heart. I don't normally talk about my faith, and not everybody shares my faith. But if you ask me who I am, I will tell you that I'm a Christian husband and father who is a lawyer. And what is important to me? Jesus teaches there are 2 commandments that we need to follow. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And how do you tell if you're actually doing what Jesus teaches? How can you tell if you're loving God, loving Jesus, and loving your neighbor? Matthew chapter 25 tells us what Jesus taught on that topic. It's how you treat 4 groups of people. It's how you treat 4 groups of people. If you're actually following Jesus, you will treat well the poor, the sick, the stranger, and the prisoner. If you call yourself a Christian and you're not really following Jesus, then you won't treat those 4 groups of people. And so in my life, what I've devoted myself to, and which I'll do when I'm Attorney General, is making sure that we take care of the poor, the sick, the stranger, and the prisoner. Because that's what we're supposed to do as Christians. Thank you. My name is Chris Christie, and I ask for your vote in the Democratic primary on June 5th.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance tonight. Let's give a round of applause for the candidates.